Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Lawrence Gold, and I am the lead of the BK2B Air Safer projects. Today's science briefing, BK2B Air Safer, is specifically focusing on identifying and remediating the airborne aerosol spread of COVID. Nothing more and nothing less. BK2B Air Safer has been making its mark on the national air quality advocacy scene. In July 2021, a high-profile BK2B Air Safer electronics warehouse and office project was featured on CBC National News. This investigative report focused on the owner's proactive dealing with his in-house air quality in order to protect his employees and his customers. The title of the CBC investigative report was appropriately named The Importance of Better Ventilation in Workplaces. And on the far right, you can see the corner of my gray hair. Just to be clear, before we get going, I want to make sure that you all understand that today's presentation is and is not. This science briefing is starting with the known and scientifically established and accepted fact that COVID is aerosol spread. We are not here to rehash the merits of a heavy droplet spread of transmission. The only question that we are addressing here today is what to do about monitoring and quantifying the risk of level of airborne aerosol respiratory droplet spread. That's it. For those in Canada and even on the national stage, you will know or will likely know that on November 12th, Dr. Tam, who is the Chief Doc of the Public Health Agency of Canada, once again publicly confirmed the aerosol droplet spread of COVID-19. She stated, and I will quote, "Most importantly, we have learned how the virus can linger in fine aerosols and remain suspended in the air we breathe, much as expelled smoke lingers in poorly ventilated spaces." Myself and my colleagues, who you'll hear from today, see little difference between the known airborne path of dangerous secondhand smoke in a poorly ventilated airspace and the known dangerous indoor floating particle spread route of secondhand COVID. While others are busying themselves arguing about dogmatic theories for transmission spread, my colleagues and myself have been establishing a floating particulate audit process, which has specifically been designed in order to proactively mediate the degree of inherent transmission risk in any given interior space. The following is a simplistic, high-level, scientific explanation of the airborne aerosol transmission route for COVID in our workplaces and elsewhere. And it's actually very simple, and it's 2 points. Number one, as you can see the little gentleman on the screen breathing out, a COVID-infected person spews out light and heavy pathogen-infused respiratory droplets. And you can see in the picture, you have little guys and you have larger guys. Number two, the exhaled or otherwise launched COVID respiratory pathogens do not travel naked. They are always surrounded by either lung fluid or saliva or the dried remnants of these fluids. These virus particles are known to float around the room in air currents or to hitch a ride on other floating particles in the air, from pollution to pollen to a piece of dislodged dust or to a fragment of shed skin or a tiny fragment of hair or hair follicle. Whatever airborne interior pollution is floating around, it's a perfect host carrier for COVID-19. I hope you like my artwork. Here at AirSafer, we quickly call these COVID particles and these other, what I call hitch a ride, transportation particulate mediums, we call them the COVID-mobiles. Don't be fooled. These COVID-mobiles come in many different sizes, shapes, and colors, and have various levels of transmission capacities. It depends entirely on which variant of concern is the vehicle occupant. Today, if you watch the media, we are worried, if not petrified, about the new particulate of concern, the new variant of concern, who we call Omicron, who's visiting us from South Africa. AirSafer has developed a preemptive auditing of interior air quality, and it's being executed by a very straightforward process of measuring the particulate levels present in the room. You saw the little picture before in regards to the little floating guys. What we are doing is we are measuring the volume of them and the size of them. It is essentially a search for a diverse array of COVID-mobiles. My colleague Frank Carnevale, Chief Growth Officer of Universal PropTech, a public company, heads up our particulate auditing team and will describe to you the logistics of this very simple COVID-mobile audit process. The screenshot on the right of this slide, please pay attention to it. It shows you a simple sampling, a screenshot of a previous project. It shows you some seriously problematic data output findings. Unfortunately, this type of highly concerning data is not going to be uncommon, as we have far too many poorly ventilated, i.e. poorly air filtered workspaces. And if you look on the right, Frank will explain it. You see some red lines and some yellow lines. He will explain, and Monona, who you are going to meet shortly, is also going to explain what those colors mean if it's anything but the base green. I just let the bag. We are honored to welcome here today an unexpected surprise, special guest speaker, Miss Monona Rossol, who many of you are already familiar with. Monona is an icon in the IAQ remediation sector. Monona was solely responsible for the development of the AirSafer airborne COVID protocols that have allowed the entire USA film industry to reopen pandemic. We want to welcome Monona and thank you for sharing your insights, concerns, and expertise with us. And also, Monona, for me personally, thank you for your ongoing mentorship. At this time, I'd like a guy that I call my right-hand man, Dr. Gabor Lantos, who has tied all of these pieces together for us, as he is both an occupational physician as well as a professional engineer. Dr. Gabor Lantos has extremely valuable and insightful boots on the ground professional experience going back to his direct involvement in SARS-1, where he developed hospital prevention measures against airborne respiratory pathogens such as TB, bird flu, and SARS. Gabor provided oral and written submissions to the SARS Commission in 2003. Gabor has been advocating for recognition of need to properly address respiratory disease spread for almost 2 decades. That's why we came together, and that's why Gabor is so welcome and himself so happy to be in a medium where we are finally getting the word out. Gabor, take it away.
Thank you very much, Larry, and good morning, everybody. I have roughly over 40 years experience in airborne hazards. As a professional engineer, I was dealing primarily with chemical and particulate hazards. And as an occupational health physician, starting with the hospitals and now with the larger community, dealing with airborne pathogens. In the age of globalization, we are having outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics every 5 years. We had SARS, we had bird flu, and now we've got COVID. And going forward, where everything is only about a 12-hour plane ride away, this will not be the last. It is paramount that we address air contaminants the way we address water. We have water purification, we need air purification. The pathogen of the moment is COVID, but we've got seasonal flu, we've had SARS before, we will have other infections coming down the road, especially with globalization. My submissions to the SARS Commission in 2003, among other things, led to their important recommendation of the Precautionary Principle, which included two things. One was to address all possible modes of infection, not just the prevailing theory. And two, that doing so requires a multidisciplinary approach. Not one set of experts, not one echo chamber, but rather people from various backgrounds all coming together. This is an article from the Canadian Medical Association Journal. I will just mention the fact, the highlighted part, ventilation is a key mitigation measure. Number two, addressing airborne transmission requires the expertise of interdisciplinary teams. Not just one set, but multiple sets. Doctors, industrial hygienists, economists, human resource people, biosafety professionals, etc. The next slide is from the British Medical Journal. Again, just how COVID has redefined and shown airborne transmission. The Lancet is another icon, 150-year-old icon of medical literature. And this article, which is April, it's almost a year ago, gave 10 scientific reasons for airborne transmission. There's many more articles since. Larry showed you one slide of Dr. Tam. I have a similar one where transmission happens in particularly if ventilation is not optimal. The purpose of this presentation is to show you some of the optimal approaches of how we can remediate airborne transmission. Public Health Ontario has a whole paper on HVAC systems to address this issue. So has the Canadian Architecture Association. These are just some examples. I think the simplest example, it's a complicated area, I know, with particulates. A simple example is when you breathe in cold air. You have all seen it. You exhale out in the cold in winter and you see a fog. Those are particulates. The very same fog that you see in the winter are carrying viral particles from somebody who is infected. Those are the particles that are important to measure directly and indirectly. First step is to audit an indoor facility. Look at some of the basics. The occupancy, the traffic flow, the carbon dioxide levels, and the particulate matters, not just from 2.5 to 10 microns, which is the conventional common way, but the submicron particles from 0.1 micron to 1.0 micron, which we will get into later. Once we've made that initial sort of diagnosis, then it's the investigations, the actual metrics. looking at the heating ventilation system, the airflow, the air currents in the facility, and then coming up with a treatment plan, a solution plan of appropriate air exchanges, sufficient power in the equipment for sufficient cubic feet per minute ventilation, getting outside air in, and using appropriate filters. Minimum Mirv 13, preferably all the way up to a HEPA filter. We need to emphasize the initial audit is essential, just like going to a doctor. The first thing they do is take a history, and then they do a physical. Same with the air. We do the audit. We take the history of the occupancy, of the airflow, of the system that's there, and then we do the investigations. Instead of blood tests and laboratory tests, we're measuring air exchanges, power of equipment, outdoor airflow, etc. Particle count is essential. It's an indirect measure of viral contamination in the air. The greater the particle count, the less efficient the quote-unquote ventilation, the more likely there to be infected particles, and vice versa. The less the particle count, the less the viral count. Thank you.
Excellent. So I will commence my part of the talk, and as a ergonomist, human factors design specialist and physiotherapist, my concern through COVID has been really the mental health impact of mixed communications, miscommunication that is occurring at different levels, even at the workplace level, and the impact that it's had on employees' mental and physical health, and the further impact this will have on people's ability or willingness to return to the workplace. So we are a national ergonomics and human factors design firm, and we're different than many other firms out there in that we look at the human being holistically. We look at all of the health of an individual. So this would be anything from air quality, safety, to lighting, to the mental demands of work, and the design of the workplace itself in terms of its impact on human productivity, health, and ergonomics. So I'm coming at this topic from that perspective because the air that people breathe, whether it's air quality or COVID, those all have an impact on the human being and human health and the ability of your employees to return to the workplace, and when they return to actually be performing at a high level. So that's where I'm coming from with this. Most people, when they hear the term ergonomics, they immediately think of a chair, they think of people sitting up straight. That's a very limited definition of the science of ergonomics and human factors design. In fact, most highly qualified ergonomists and human factors design specialists will look at the entire environment, air quality, temperature, humidity, the filters that Gabor has talked about, noise and distractions, and that's become a big issue with open office, for example. We look at the visual environment, physical, and also importantly, the mental demands and cognitive loads. And that's what I want to focus on today in terms of the confusion relative to messaging, and certainly with social media, some of the mixed messaging that's creating a lot of mental health issues for your employees. So this is essentially what your employees are looking at right now as return to the workplace is starting, and as we proceed with trying to normalize the workplace. So on their minds very much is COVID, trying to understand actually what it is. Should you wear a cloth mask? Should you wear an N95? All of these discussions that are occurring, and certainly the confusion relative to traveling, which has now been increased in the last week or so. So here's some of the facts in terms of we have interviewed over 500 of your employees across Canada as part of virtual home office ergonomic studies. We've been actually asking via questionnaire about their mental states as well. What we were trying to do in this regard is, one, look at the ergonomics, but also determine if there's any employees who are struggling with mental health to be able to make sure that they were referred for the appropriate care strategies with their employers. So 73% of the over 500 employees we've interviewed state that they are concerned and feeling stress about returning to the workplace, even if it's a hybrid type of model. So what they're concerned about is safety and health. Are the employer interventions and public health interventions actually going to be enough to keep them safe? Will there be good mental health support for them if they are actually struggling with this? And lastly, their third concern is ergonomic support as it relates to their health and as their health has been diminishing over the last several months. So here's some of the strategies that are being used in the workplace, and perhaps you can get a good understanding as to why people's mental health is actually becoming problematic. The image of many employees of returning to an open office design, which is very common in North America in particular. And here we have a typical example of bench seating. Much of the hybrid return to work is going to involve people not being assigned seating. And many employees are expressing to us concern about not having a place or a zone where they know that they would be safe. And in this case, you're looking at an open office and they have a plexiglass divider between the employees. Then you see the images on the top right where people are spraying down surfaces. And I'll let Monona talk further about some of this, given the fact that COVID is an airborne transmitted virus. Then we come to signage, and you'll see the confusion of the message. There's signs all over several buildings, signs on the floor, et cetera, directing people to walk in a certain direction, et cetera. So all of this together is creating a sort of the perfect storm for people struggling with mental health and confusion. One thing that many employers are not aware of as they look towards, particularly for human resources and facility managers, as they look at returning employees, most of them on a hybrid basis, is that employees actually do have a right to refuse work. Here's the example in Canada and also the OSH Act of United States, very similar acts in the EU. Employees who feel that their workplace is not safe do have the right to refuse work. My understanding in speaking to several labor and employment lawyers is there's already a number of cases that are starting through various formats where employees are actually refusing to return to the workplace because they actually don't feel safe, secure, and healthy in the return. Many months ago, our Prime Minister here in Canada talked about speaking moistly. This has become a meme all over social media, but he actually was, he was in fact right about this. Whether he stumbled upon this or someone caught his ear and he was able to understand that COVID is an airborne aerosolized virus. Either way, he caught this right. And when I did the search on the web for this, there's lots of t-shirts and hoodies I noticed for Christmas gifts relative to speaking moistly. So what's actually needed to help our employees and to help with their mental health and help them feel that their health and safety will be taken care of as they return to the workplace? It's incumbent upon the C-suite, employers, our political leaders, facility managers, building owners, to actually apply the science related to COVID and also be very transparent with employees. They need to see that their safety is going to be taken care of. So that may be, for example, giving a stamp of approval, COVID-19 free zone as an example for healthy buildings. And being able to show them visually in quick visuals the particulate matter that's in the air and that what are the solutions that are being put in place for them. So at the bottom line, COVID is airborne. Buildings and HVAC systems can ensure that employees are healthy and that their mental health is taken care of, whether that's air quality, VOCs, carbon dioxide, etc., all the way to COVID. We need to start talking about investing in building health, because in the absence of building health, we can't have employee health. And here's some of the ROI for that. And that wraps up my discussion about mental health and how we can get employees successfully back into the workplace. And I'll turn this over to Monona or Frank.
Great, thank you. Let me just start this off here for 1 second here. And there we go, 1 second. Great, so thank you so much for joining us. My name is Frank Carnevale. I'm the Chief Growth Officer of Universal PropTech. My quick part of this presentation is really about what's in your air, and I'm going to walk you through what we've done as a company. So who we are very quickly, we're a publicly traded company. We deliver healthy buildings by integrating property technology, PropTech, into building automation systems. Our operating company, VCI Controls, has developed its building technology that's really in use in federal, government, and other commercial buildings for over 40 years. We looked at the pandemic and really tried to understand what the new realities would be going forward. And we landed on measuring indoor air quality, specifically the sub-micron levels, to identify opportunities to improve a building's health. And I'm going to walk you through that. As a company, we appreciate there's a lot of viewers who were from a lot of these companies. We partner with very strategic companies like Lumen Ultra, Air Sniper, Fresh Air UV, Atmos Air. We partner with them because we understood that from the remediation perspective, there's going to have to be a solution set that helps clean the air and clean these sites. But then we also figured out we need to get in earlier on identifying the submicron level. So why are we hosting this webinar? While we are an entry point into the growing PropTech market, we do work with global partnerships. We can't do this alone. So we work with global partnerships to provide customers with state-of-the-art technologies that really best suits their needs for today and tomorrow. We're sharing this integrated approach specifically on this with BK2B and AirSafer. Larry Gold approached us and we were working together to do a number of audits with this amazing group that's on the webinar today. And these expert panelists know what submicron particles mean in today's environment. And let me get to that. So what are we doing exactly? UPI, we installed a number of indoor air quality monitoring kits. These kits specifically are from P.Eng Systems. They have an amazing IAQ sensor platform, and we've been integrating them into our mobile indoor air quality audit kits and collecting the data, creating the reporting, and really we're going down the path of integrating them into our own building automation systems. So we're pretty excited with that. But P.Eng has been a really great partner of ours. We collect a number of data points every few seconds, from everything from particulate matter 10 down to 0.1. And the system includes an air quality index rating for each of those categories, and specifically based on the EPA standards out of the United States. We do have visibility into the mass of the particulate matter, and in addition to the actual particle count, among others. So it's pretty exciting what we believe we're coming up with. So again, we partnered with P.Eng Systems because really their indoor air quality sensors are certified at the under 1 micron size, that sub-micron size. And that's what we're finding is a critical piece that's changed since the pandemic had started. And so what did we do? And there's a cute little picture of me installing these sensors. What did we do? We installed to date 3 kits, sort of indoor air quality monitoring kits, over 15 units in 3 facilities in Ottawa and the Greater Toronto area. And we've been monitoring the data to generate insights, and we're having a lot of fun with what we've seen. As you can see on there, they're pretty small. These are temporary items that we're installing in facilities to monitor the air quality of those specific places. And here's what we found. So there's a lot of information. I'm going to give you the key points, and I'll show you the diagrams and discuss them in a minute. Here's a simple one. As the outside temperature is dropping to freezing for the last number of weeks, really evidence shows that the heating system that's kicking up or is picking up is kicking out a number of stray particulate matter 0.1 to 0.5 particles, and they float around for dozens of minutes. So literally, as a building is drawing on its HVAC system, we see a tremendous amount of these stray particles just floating around rather quickly in the area of obviously our sensors to be able to catch it. But that says a lot, because it also means nothing is capturing them because they're able to float around every time the ventilation system kicks on. And then prior to the colder days, just sort of interest, we were noticing on average about, give or take, about 1,000 particle count per minute per person in the room of the PM.1 in most of our sites. So we're starting to get to the point where we can understand how many particles we do expect of that 0.1 level per person, and we can start to do a lot of things with that. As soon as the heating season came on, wow, what an increase. So we were seeing increases of multiples higher than the average person we were seeing. And adding in one case, we saw submicron, so 0.3 particles. The count was up to 2 million within a minute of heating being turned on. And so if I can point you to this slide here, or this section here, it looks so small down here because they're moving, but in one spike within about 2 minutes of the heat being turned on, 0.3 reached almost 2.5 particle count. That's 2.5 million particles within a cubic meter that could have easily gone into someone's lungs within seconds, and Monona will get more into that. So just give an example of, we are seeing dramatic events when heating is turned on in a place that obviously has some issues. We've also seen very unhealthy, and I'll explain that. We've seen very unhealthy air for air quality index of PM 2.5. And those conditions were present with Mirv 8s installed. And so Mirv 8s are the filters. And so if you look at the scale up here, it's just a very simple way to look at it. The air quality index from the EPA, it's simple. I have these dials here and all these little graphs. These are all air quality index dials. And when they get over 50, they go into moderate mode. When they get over 100 to 150, it's in unhealthy for sensitive groups. 150 to 200, it's unhealthy. 200 to 300, very unhealthy. And then you have hazardous. Let's just say we've seen unhealthy, as in this graph, in one of our sensors in a certain location had unhealthy air for this 1 minute, although it stretched beyond that, and it was considered very unhealthy. That is problematic. And we're seeing this in a place that has Mirv 8s, and even during that period, we're seeing with in-room HEPA units on a very unhealthy air quality. And again, and the last point is very unhealthy air as well for AQI of PM 2.5 when in-room HEPA units are on. So that says a lot, that the in-room HEPA units, their size and everything matter, wasn't necessarily solving the problem. And I'll take you up to this far right one. These are just two dials at one point in time. So I want to outline these little lines going across right here represent the last hour that this was recorded on that particular day. So for that hour, every single minute except for 2 were unhealthy, and 2 of them were very unhealthy. So that's 1 hour's worth that I happen to record here of the air quality index being unhealthy, and a 2 times very unhealthy. This wasn't even just a spike. This was 1 hour worth of spewing air that would make someone sick in that room. So these are just some of the things that I want to identify we found. We'll leave it to some smarter people to determine what that means and why that should be problematic. Key takeaways, look, from our opinion, owning an HVAC services building controls company, you need to monitor your indoor air quality, period. HVAC systems and facilities are unique, and no confidence that AQI is healthy without measuring IAQ levels. So you don't know for sure you have healthy air if you're not measuring it. And as we've seen in some examples, HEPA units alone aren't enough. Second point is ventilation systems are resting ground for submicron particles. Clearly, we've had millions of particles being spewed out of systems. They were resting somewhere. They're not being caught by filters, and they're just waiting for a brush of air to push them right back out and float around and carry for enough time in order to hit people's lungs. So that's pretty critical. The PM 2.5 air quality index and the submicron particles are maintaining healthy air and limiting the spread of virus present. We're finding those two critical points are useful in tweaking, maintaining, the effectiveness of a system if you're monitoring those two components. We're very excited that we have that capability. And the last is solutions to remediate need to be as customized as the HVAC systems themselves. And that's really just to say every building that's installed an HVAC system has different size motors, systems, different CFM, different capacity to bring air into the building, take it back out. And they're all quite unique. Some of them are sort of cookie cutter, and they need to you need to understand the capabilities of a building in order to, and its needs in order to really refine that system. I'm looking forward to the additional discussion, but I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I will stop sharing and pull this back. Thank you so much, and let me just change the screen here. And next, I believe we have Monona.
You'll have to unmute me.
You're not muted.
Oh, it says I'm muted. Okay, no problem. So first, I just have to correct something. Larry is my friend, and he loves me, and I love him, but he overdid it a bit. Single-handedly, nothing was done in the film industry. There were 10 experts that on the original plan. We have epidemiologists, infectious disease people. We have engineers, industrial hygienists, and the whole work. My job happened to be air quality and setting the ventilation standards, and that I did sort of do alone. But basically, it's no one does anything single-handedly in this business. Okay, so let's get on to the issue today, because you heard a lot about the air quality indices, and here's your same color scheme showing that the higher the amounts, the more toxic it is, so less is better, and the smaller the particulate, there's PM10 and PM2.5. That's particulate matter, 10 microns and 2.5 microns. And the reason that's true is that the smaller the particle, the deeper it goes in the lungs. And everybody has seen somewhere in their high school days pictures of the lungs with the big tubes, and they get smaller and smaller, and they get down to the little tiny alveoli where the air exchanges, where you get your oxygen. And if particles are small enough to get down here, which PM 2.5 is, and the submicrons really are good at it, that can really mess up your health. So now we understand that the bigger particles are going to land in the upper part of the lung, the smaller ones are going to go deeper and deeper, and the ultrafine particles can actually even cross the blood-brain barrier. And that may account for some of the peculiar COVID symptoms. So now we next need to look at, that's just plain old air pollution. Now we need to look at this SARS virus. And when you look at the electron micrographs of the bug itself, you see that it just ranges between about 0.06 microns to about 0.14. So your average is usually quoted as being 0.125. So you really don't have to worry much below 0.1, because that's the size of the bug. Even more important, it never goes naked. The goo goes along. Most of these are coming from the lung, where you're going to have water, mucus, long mucus and sticky proteins, and some of the lung surfactants in these particles. But you don't have to look at that water there and be a genius to figure out that those particles aren't going to stay the size that they come out of your mouth. They're going to dry, and that those mucus particles are going to end up forming a protective coating around this this particle. And the longer they're airborne, the more of them are created small. So there are the droplets that range from 10 to 100 microns, or sometimes even bigger. We'll probably be calling those the gobsmackers. Then there's the aerosol that we're most concerned about, but even better, between 5 and 0.1 is your area of most concern. And this means the particle is unlikely to be much smaller than about 0.1 microns. This is from the Fluid Physics Journal, and it shows how the gobsmackers are pretty heavy and they end up going onto surfaces, and your other particles end up floating in the air, very similar to smoke. Only you now know that they aren't even going to stay that size. They're going to get smaller when they hit the air. Okay. What about the really large ones? Well, if there's air currents present, then they too can become smaller particles because all of that water is going to go away. So we can actually create some small particles from some of the larger ones. And the principles in creating the aerosol are basically the lower the humidity and the higher the temperature, the more you're going to have those form. Some of the fluid physics journals concentrate on the cloud, saying that it has its own atmosphere, but eventually it disperses. And once it is totally dispersed, then the particles come in contact with the actual air in the room, and then you have the dehydration. We also know where the different size particles arise, thanks to the work primarily of this young lady here, Moroska. If you want to do some research, this is the name, one of the names you want to get on your list of articles. And the 1 micron particles are generated primarily in the bronchioles. Those are the little tiny tubes below, just above the alveoli. And the 5 micron and those area are usually in the larynx. The gobsmackers are in the mouth, and they're the ones that are going to be covered with saliva. And they're the ones we're least worried about because of where they usually go. So now we understand the particles going into the lung and where they deposit. We understand the particles coming out of the lung, and we know that the alveoli are crucial in this. And for one more fact, the alveolar cells have ACE2 receptors. That may not mean anything to you if you haven't been reading about the research, but those are the cells that are needed for the bug to get into you to reproduce. It cannot reproduce on its own. It has to get into one of your cells and hijack its reproductive mechanism, but it needs that ACE2 receptor. All of those cells are ACE2 receptors. And so if the infection starts there, it tends to be one of the most serious infections. Now, back to our air pollution, because they're the same size particles that we've been looking at. Air pollution can include these same small size particles as the virus, and they tend to move in random collision pathways. And when they hit a virus particle, the air pollution and the virus particles will stick together. This is due to van der Waals forces. They're like two little planets that both have their own gravity. You can think of it that way. And in order to capture those particles, whether they're air pollution or whether they are from the virus, the HEPA filter is, of course, best, and it uses at least 4 mechanisms to capture them. The large particles hit a fiber and stick to it due to van der Waals forces. The really small ones make their wickedly strange pathways and eventually hit a fiber. But it is these particles that are in between that want to ride on the air currents around the filter fibers. They usually talk about that occurring at 0.3 microns, but the new research shows that it's probably closer to 0.12 to 0.17. But what you need to know is, except for a HEPA, all filters have this dip at somewhere around 0.1 to 0.3, and it starts at usually 1. So the very area that we're most concerned about, 0.1 to 1, is the area that is least captured by especially the Mirv filters, the ones that are in the HVAC. There's this area. So the HEPA would be right close to this upper line, but these other filters are missing some of the most important ones. What is a Mirv? Minimum Efficiency Reporting Value. This was a standard developed by ASHRAE way back when in the 80s. And its original purpose was to capture a standard or typical dust, and its purpose was to protect the fans and air handling equipment. It was never, never, never meant for air quality. It has recently become used that way, but that was not its purpose. So when you look at what they actually capture, you can see if you're running a Mirv 8, you are getting nothing in the area that you need. It isn't even rated there. And the Mirv 13 only gets 50% of those really small and most dangerous particles. Okay, so let's look at our takeaway. Both the virus-containing particles and the air pollution particles that are most likely to remain airborne, like smoke, 4 hours, are those from 0.1 to 5. You will see other papers telling you that up to 10, but all of these will stay airborne on their own without any air currents or anything else. They will just float almost like gases and vapors. Mirv filters fail in the area of the worst possible range for this pandemic. They're physically hard to capture for all filters except the HEPA. This is why the minimum HVAC filter's got to be at least a Mirv 13, and you would prefer a HEPA if you could get it. These particles are the most dangerous because they stay airborne the longest. They deposit deepest in the lung. That's down in the alveoli, causing the worst infections. And that's why I'm appearing here. I really approve of the project that these people are working on. And that's that they monitor the particles of 1 micron and under. And that is the best way to determine if there's an excessive risk due to this particle size in the facility, both from the pollution and from the bug riding on it, or the bug alone, which can be in the air. I can't think of a better start. They will be looking at other types of monitoring very shortly, but this is where you want to start your monitoring. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's obviously a very important area. We all have learned a lot. We're obviously drawing attention to something which has been grossly neglected. Too much of the world is busy washing their hands and their groceries, et cetera, and ignoring what has to be dealt with, which is what's floating in there. Do we really, as you can see from some of my LinkedIn postings, we won't drink a glass of contaminated water. Why in the world would you share contaminated air with your friends? And the information that's come out with Frank, et cetera, looking at these printouts of what is seen in the air is almost like watching a moving picture where you can see exactly what's going on in the room. So we're going to get to a couple of questions that have come in. And the first one, I think, is most appropriately directed to Monona, and you've kind of answered it already. You've obviously indicated the need to have a multidisciplinary approach to solving the pandemic problem. And from what I've noted, we have a lot of doctors who are making commentary on how to solve what to solve. Just explain to the audience why you are such a believer in this multidisciplinary group. I'm sorry for putting you on the pedestal. Why have we got the wrong people talking?
Yes, because your CDC, the United States CDC, and the World Health Organization are primarily medical people. And I'm excluding Gabor in this because he is an engineer as well, so he understands both ends of it. But your average doctor, if you ask him how many diffusers are in their own office, will not even know what the question means. You don't want to be talking ventilation with medical people, and they never saw it as an important issue. They never really got it, and their recommendations were ridiculously basic and wrong, talking about open windows. So you don't go to a doctor for your, ventilation expertise. You go to somebody who designs and specifies ventilation and understands the issues. So this is why it's really important to have ventilation people and doctors and infectious disease people and people who do monitoring like Frank. That's another specialty in industrial hygiene monitoring. So, I mean, all of those things are important to put together a whole program.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Monona. And part of the crux of what we're doing here and why we joined forces with Jane is because her expansive, I would call it her expansive discussions or understanding of workplace health, not just being an issue of, am I sitting up correctly at my desk? So Jane, this one was tailor-made for you. Jane, I'm getting a lot of pushback from my staff. They are hesitant to come back to the office. They are concerned. What do I tell them and what do I do?
I think what we need to start to do is get managers, office managers, facility managers to actually talk to the building owners, the commercial building owners where people are working, and to ask them if they are some simple questions. Are they measuring particulate matter? What are they doing in terms of just air quality monitoring on an ongoing basis? And how can you make that process transparent? Employees need to see those results. They can be in a very simplified format, such as what Frank reviewed, but we need to start to change the conversation away from things such as wiping surfaces and having people in open concept offices, and start to turn this towards more of HVAC, engineering, airflow, and start to get the actual property managers and building owners to be part of that conversation.
Okay. And just to address
I mentioned earlier, just brushed over some of the metrics. Any employer that can demonstrate good metrics, we've covered some of them. If they can demonstrate to their workers or to the Ministry of Labor that their metrics are good, that's basically as far as science can go to reassure somebody that they're not zero risk. Life is not zero risk, but that the air has been remediated as much as humanly possible to contain as little infectious particles as possible. And there are the metrics to demonstrate it to the workers, to the Ministry of Labor, to whomever.
And a very important question that's coming up again in pieces. We don't want to overstate what we are looking at when we look at Frank's data coming in. And I think I'm going to direct this one to Monona. Monona, people have asked, are you identifying COVID? So Frank does his fancy work, and we find all these small submicron pieces. Is he finding COVID? Are you looking at COVID? What are you looking at there?
You're simply looking at the particle size, and you know that if you've got that particle size, if there's someone infected in that environment, then you're toast, because that is one of the particle sizes that you're concerned about. If there is no one who's infected in that particle size, then you're dealing only with air pollution. But you can't know that in advance. But if you have that size particle, there's something wrong with the ventilation, and it will not capture the particle that you're concerned about.
Monona, are you surprised at all if you read the newspapers in the last couple of days? We had a restaurant up here, 42 people, all double vaccinated, breakout. There was an article last night on a cruise line where they had a breakout. Are you surprised?
No, not at all. We knew that was going to happen. This is why also when we talked about multidiscipline, the fluid physics people understood this way early. That's why we decided way back in June of 2020 that it was airborne. We were way ahead just simply by reading the right papers. So again, we've got to look at all of these disciplines and not just stick with the medical.
And
I would add that we knew it with SARS-1 in 2003 that it was airborne.
Yeah.
And this is the same family, it's the same coronavirus, minor differences, but it's essentially this. We knew it during SARS, and you can read this in the SARS Commission report, anybody who wants to. We knew then that it was airborne.
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
we
we
even saw
knew it.
building to building transmission.
It's who's reading what literature.
And Gabor, and this is for Gabor and Jane because it looks like a loaded question here. When Frank is again doing his monitoring, or we're picking up all these subparticles, Gabor, are you just looking at the potential of COVID floating around? What other nasties are buried in these particulates? And then to Jane, what is the correlation between safe air and employee performance and mental health? And maybe we'll start off with Jane and then go to Gabor.
Yeah, there's been a good deal of research over the last several decades about the impact of, for lack of a better word, healthy buildings. And by healthy buildings, that would include anything from having appropriate human factors design. And one thing I was just reading an article this morning about how air quality itself has actually been ignored in large measure by commercial building owners, and tenants haven't been able to really impress upon them the need to have safe and more oxygen, all of those things that are needed for human performance. So it's well known that humans perform poorly when we don't have proper air quality. VOCs that are in the air, CO2, other things that aren't properly being removed from the air. So there's a very distinct body of work about the fact that when we don't have good, proper air in the workplace or a school or a university, our performance decreases. And a prime example is anyone that's listening to this. How many of you have been in a small meeting room in your office environment and you find that you're starting to get quite tired, and then you leave the room and all of a sudden you feel more refreshed and your energy level changes? That's a distinct difference between poor air quality in a meeting room that often occurs versus out in a more open space.
And Gabor, from a technical point of view, again, you've been beating the respiratory droplet spread drum for 20 years now. What else is embedded in these little COVID mobiles? Potentially.
Before I answer that question, I just happen to have a slide that particular to what Jane just said. Geez, what's here? There it is. Does ventilation pay? This is nothing to do with what we're talking about, but what Jane was saying. Productivity goes up when there's good ventilation. You can measure it in terms of sick, and there have been studies. This is one study. There are many others where sick days go down. I mean, that's a fairly easy way of measuring productivity. Sick days go down, and one can calculate that by salaries or in any number of ways. But this is just one study how ventilation, quite apart from pathogens, but just because of the carbon dioxide levels, the stuffiness, the relative humidity, and all the other things affects productivity. So
I have about a dozen.
And getting back to the question of what else can be in the air, anybody who's seen a sunbeam come through the window, you can see all the different sizes of particles that sun ray is bouncing off. So I've said with globalization, we're going to have outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics every 5 years. Apart from that, we've got seasonal flu. They're going to be on these particles. They're particles. You've got fungal spores. If anybody ever had fungus on their skin, where do you think it comes from? The spores are in the air. They settle on the skin. We're all contaminated with millions of these. Under right circumstances, immunosuppression, humidity, dark spaces, etc., we get fungal infections. I'm talking
all
about
right. All right,
so
ladies.
the spores are on these particles, food particles, all the other cold, quote-unquote cold particles, the coronaviruses, which is the common cold, respiratory syncytial virus. So the particles will be all kinds of particles. It is not limited to COVID by any means.
All right. Well, thank you, Frank. Thank you, colleagues. It's time for Elvis to leave the building because we've overstayed our welcome in the cyber world. Just a quick wrap-up statement. There's clearly a change in tide out there in the world. Here in Canada, the simple fact that Dr. Tam is suddenly making a statement in regards to aerosol spread. If you go back to Thanksgiving, our Prime Minister in his Thanksgiving message said, remember ventilation. And just last night, I got a phone call from one of the restaurants that we remediated. The TV people want to come in and they want to have a look at his proactive steps that he's taken in order to deal with air quality in his space. Anyway, time to wrap it up. Thank you very much. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year to everyone. And
Happy
Frank,
Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah too.
Hanukkah.
Belated happy Hanukkah to everyone.
And Frank, thank you for being the guru in your little stream studio there. And if you don't mind, could you set up something there which indicates to people how they can reach out to any one of us in order to get more information or to contact or to make a request to come in and do one of your magical audits? And maybe you could just put up a slide, or you can reach out to any one of us. Reach out to myself, reach out to Gabor, reach out to Jane, reach out to Frank, and call us, and we'll be there. Thank you very much, and God bless all.
Thank you,
care.
everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.